I am Penelope Hayes, and 42 days before I was supposed to walk down the aisle, my own mother looked across her formal dining table and ordered me to hand my wedding venue over to my older sister. I sat there in my work clothes with drywall dust still hidden in my hair, holding a linen napkin, while my family told me to step aside because my sister's fiancé came from better pedigree. I will tell you the exact words they used. But first I want you to hold the image of my sister's triumphant smile in your mind, because less than 12 hours later, that smile would shatter when her elite wedding planner called to inform her that the venue owner had canceled her booking. None of them knew I was the owner. They thought the story ended when I quietly nodded and gave up my day. Welcome back to Sophia Vengeance, where the quiet ones finally stop keeping the peace and start keeping the receipts. If you appreciate cold patience and airtight paperwork, you are in the right place. Drop a comment with your age and tell me where you are listening from, and be sure to subscribe. This one begins with a stolen date, and it ends with a single sheet of notarized paper that locked a greedy family out in the cold. Let me take you back to that dinner in Asheville. It was a Tuesday evening in early September. The twilight was settling over the Blue Ridge Mountains, throwing long shadows across my parents' manicured lawn. My mother, Vivian, modeled her entire existence on the historic grandeur of the Biltmore estate. Heavy velvet drapes framed the windows, and antique silver centerpieces weighed down a dining table long enough to seat 12, though it currently held just 4 of us. She lived for the heritage and pageantry of North Carolina high society. Optics were her religion, and her children were merely props arranged to elevate her display. My older sister Caroline tapped her crystal wine glass with a manicured fingernail. She had been engaged to a man named Preston for 8 months, but they had refused to set a date until tonight. Preston and I made a decision, Caroline announced. She offered a bright, camera-ready smile. "We cannot wait until next spring. We are getting married this fall, October 14th. I stopped cutting my chicken. The silver knife clinked against the fine china. October 14th. That was my date. The date I had spent 14 months planning around. The date printed on the heavy cardstock invitations currently sitting in a box on my entryway console. I looked at my mother, waiting for her to correct Caroline. I waited for her to remind her oldest daughter that the family calendar was already marked, that my caterer was booked, that my deposit was spent. Instead, Vivian carefully placed her fork down on her plate and turned to me. "Preston's family has relatives flying in from Geneva," Vivian said. Her tone was smooth, transactional, the voice she used when negotiating charity board seats. "The country club is booked, and they need something historic, something with gravity. We need the Stone Chapel Penelope. You will need to transfer your booking to Caroline's planner tomorrow morning." I stared at the woman who raised me. It was not a request. It was an edict delivered over roasted asparagus. "I have had that date locked down for over a year," I said. I kept my voice level. I did not let the hurt bleed into the room, because hurt is a currency my family uses against you. My father, Richard, finally looked up from his meal. He ran a local real estate brokerage. He was a man who measured human affection entirely in leverage. "Do not make this difficult, Penelope," he said. "Caroline's marriage aligns our family with Preston's. It is a strategic move. Give her the venue. If you refuse and embarrass us in front of his parents, do not bother coming home for Thanksgiving or Christmas. We will not tolerate a fractured front in this family." A threat of exile handed across the table like a dinner roll. Caroline reached across the table and covered my calloused hand with her soft one. "I know it is an inconvenience, Pen," she said, "but you and David can just go to the courthouse. It fits your vibe anyway. You have always been so practical." She offered a tight, sympathetic smile that did not reach her eyes. She wanted a fight. She wanted me to cry, to raise my voice, to make a scene so she could play the victim and brand me the difficult, jealous daughter. I looked down at my plate. I thought about the heavy brass keys currently sitting in the bottom of my leather purse. I thought about the zoning permits, the structural beams I had reinforced the year of sanding century-old floorboards. My family viewed my architectural restoration career as dirty manual labor. They assumed I was just a blue-collar worker scraping by on small hourly wages. They thought they were strong-arming me out of a $5,000 rental deposit. I pulled my hand out from under Caroline's. I took a slow sip of my ice water. The ice rattled against the glass, the only sound in the suffocating room. "Fine," I said, "it is yours." Caroline gasped in delight and threw her arms around my shoulders, squeezing me in a cloud of expensive perfume. My mother sighed in relief, praising my maturity and my willingness to support the family. My father went back to his steak, satisfied that the ledger was balanced in his favor. They did not know I had not rented the stone chapel. I had bought it at a commercial auction. I held the deed under a blind holding company. Tomorrow morning, Caroline's expensive wedding planner was going to call the property management office to update the contract, and she was going to find out that the venue owner had just erased her from the calendar. I drove back to my own house that night with the radio turned off. The silence in the car felt like a sanctuary after the suffocating air of my parents' formal dining room. On the passenger seat, my leather work bag sat heavy, anchored by the weight of 5 antique brass keys on a cast-iron ring. Those keys clinked gently every time I took a sharp turn on the winding mountain roads. They were the original keys to the stone chapel. I reached over in the dark and ran my fingertips across the cold, ridged metal. My family did not know what those keys unlocked. To them, I was just Penelope the Disappointment, who played in the dirt. I am an architectural restorationist. I specialize in the forgotten 19th century properties scattered through the Blue Ridge Mountains, the grand old estates that sit rotting in the long shadow of the Biltmore. My mother and father see the plaster dust on my jeans and the calluses on my palms. They introduce me to their country club friends as their daughter who does construction work, their voices dipping into a hushed, apologetic tone. They look at my unpolished fingernails and sigh, wishing I had chosen a clean, respectable profession like corporate law or public relations. They do not see the math, they do not read the blueprints, they have no concept of the metrics I manage every single day. I calculate the tensile strength of century-old oak beams. I authorize wire transfers for $40,000 custom steel supports to save a sagging slate roofline. I spend weeks managing teams of master artisans to strip layers of cheap paint off original heart pine floors, revealing the resilient, pristine grain underneath. There is a profound, quiet dignity in taking a broken structure and making it strong again. I learned a long time ago that you cannot build a lasting foundation on cheap materials. That is a lesson my family never grasped. Caroline is 31 years old, and she operates on an entirely different metric. She is a lifestyle influencer. Her life is a meticulously curated digital grid of pastel brunches, designer handbags, and luxury hotel stays, all underwritten by our father and his limitless credit cards. She has never built a single thing with her own hands. She extracts. She consumes. She relies on the illusion of success rather than the heavy, unglamorous weight of it. Preston, her fiancé, is her exact mirror. He is the heir to a regional logistics firm, a man whose entire personality is tied to his golf handicap and the logo on his polo shirt. He is loud, wealthy, and remarkably hollow. He fits perfectly into my parents' rigid framework of what a successful man should look like. During family dinners, Preston brags about his stock portfolio and his new boat, and my father leans in, hanging on every empty word. My fiancé David does not fit that framework. David teaches high school history. He drives a sensible sedan that is 8 years old. He does not wear designer watches, and he does not need to dominate the conversation at a dinner party to feel important. He is steady. He loves the quiet nature in me, the part of me that prefers the honest silence of an empty building to the performative chatter of a gala. When I told David I wanted a small, simple life with him, he smiled and said, "That sounded like heaven." We did not need a circus, we just needed each other. But my parents viewed David the same way they viewed my career. He was insufficient. He lacked the social gravity they craved. They treated him with polite indifference, saving their warm embraces and expensive bottles of wine for Preston. I watched them fawn over Preston for 8 months, watching them worship the illusion of his pedigree while ignoring the solid reality of the man sitting right next to me. I never told my family about my commercial success. I never told them that the historic restoration market is a highly lucrative arena. I kept my holding company blind, and I kept my business bank accounts private. I learned early that in the Hayes family, any asset you possess is not your own. It is a community resource to be plundered for Caroline and her brand. If my father knew I held a commercial real estate portfolio worth millions, he would not be proud. He would simply view me as a new line of credit to fund Caroline and her lifestyle. He would demand I leverage my properties to elevate her social standing. So I stayed quiet. I let them think I was struggling. I let them think they were strong-arming me out of a mere $5,000 venue deposit tonight. I turned into my driveway. The porch light was on. David was inside, probably grading history essays at the kitchen table, waiting for me to come home so we could talk about our wedding. The wedding I had just given away with a single nod of my head. I turned off the engine, but I did not get out of the car. I sat in the dark driveway, listening to the engine tick as it cooled in the crisp night air. I picked up my bag and pulled out the ring of heavy brass keys. I held them in the palm of my hand, feeling their sharp edges press into my calluses. The stone chapel was a masterpiece of 1920s masonry. I had purchased it out of foreclosure 14 months ago. The roof had been caved in, the stained glass was shattered. I had spent the last year pouring my own capital and my own sweat into its bones, transforming it into an elite high-dollar event space. It was not just a venue, it was my masterpiece. It was my proof that I could build something beautiful that my family could not touch or control. And tonight Caroline had claimed it as her own, assuming she could simply take the fruit of my labor because our parents demanded it. She thought I was just the quiet, compliant little sister giving up her rental slot. Before I could open the car door, my phone screen lit up the dark interior. A text message from Caroline, then another, then a third. I did not even have my seatbelt unbuckled, and she was already beginning the extraction. I picked up the phone. The messages were not requests. They were administrative orders, typed out with the casual entitlement of a queen addressing a servant. Send me the contact number for the venue coordinator tonight. Preston wants to secure the catering menu by tomorrow afternoon. I need your deposit receipts so we can transfer the credit to my account. Also, forward me the florist email. I need to change your color palette. Navy is too drab for an October wedding. Do not drag your feet on this pen. I read the words 3 times. She did not ask how I felt. She did not apologize for hijacking the date I had chosen a year ago. She just wanted the vendor list. She wanted to slip into the infrastructure I had painstakingly built and paint her name over mine. She wanted to erase me from my own day. The sheer audacity of it sat in my chest heavy and cold. I looked at the brass keys in my hand. Then I looked at the glowing screen. I typed a single sentence back to my sister. I will have the venue coordinator contact your planner directly tomorrow morning to handle the transition. I hit send. I watched the little notification indicate that the message was delivered. Caroline replied instantly with a heart emoji, a small digital pat on the head for being a compliant little sister. I put the phone in my purse. I gathered my keys. I walked up the front steps to my house where my steady fiancé was waiting. I did not feel sad. I did not feel betrayed. I felt a cold, clinical clarity. My sister wanted my venue. My mother wanted a seamless transition. Tomorrow morning they were going to get exactly what they asked for, delivered by a property management lawyer who answers only to me. I walked through the front door of my home and found David at the kitchen table. He was grading history essays with a red pen under the warm glow of a pendant light. He looked up, took one glance at my exhausted face, and set the pen down. He asked what my parents had done this time. I told him Caroline decided she wanted a fall wedding, and my parents demanded we surrender our date and our location to accommodate her new fiancé. David did not shout. He did not punch a wall. He just shook his head, pulled me into a long hug, and asked if we should start looking for a courthouse dress. I leaned against his chest, listening to his steady heartbeat, and told him I had already handled the venue transition. It was the truth, just not the entire truth. I needed to let the trap snap shut before I showed him the full blueprint. I needed to protect his peace of mind. 14 months prior, the stone chapel was nothing but a forgotten relic. It sat on 12 acres of overgrown land at the edge of the mountains, hidden behind thick tangles of wild blackberry bushes and suffocating ivy. It was originally built in the 1920s by a textile baron, a structure forged from native river stone and heavy timber. When I found it listed in a commercial foreclosure auction, the roof was partially collapsed. Decades of water damage had rotted the subfloor. The original stained glass windows were boarded up with cheap plywood, and the copper plumbing had been stripped by vandals. The local real estate developers looked at the listing and saw a heavy financial liability. They saw demolition costs and environmental cleanup fees. I looked at the structural bones and saw an empire waiting to be unearthed. I attended the county auction in a pair of steel-toed boots and a faded denim jacket. My father would have scoffed if he saw me sitting in the back row, among the seasoned commercial investors in their tailored suits. But I did not bid with emotion or ego. I bid with calculated precision. The gavel fell at $412,000. I signed the purchase agreement with a steady hand, acquiring a commercial asset worth triple that amount in raw land value alone. But I did not put the deed in the name of Penelope Hayes. I knew the rules of my family better than anyone. So I built a fortress out of paperwork. I hired a specialized corporate attorney in Raleigh, 3 hours away from my father's real estate firm, to draft the founding documents. We formed a blind holding company named Blue Ridge Heritage Holdings. My name appeared only on the private operating agreement, hidden in a fireproof safe in my home office, but the public tax records and property databases listed only a registered agent. For the next year, I operated a dual life. During the day, my parents judged my calloused hands and my dusty work trucks. They sighed over my lack of a corporate wardrobe. They had no idea I was sitting in municipal planning meetings, securing commercial zoning permits. They did not know I was navigating complex environmental impact studies, securing commercial liquor licenses, and drafting high-value vendor contracts. I spent my mornings analyzing profit margins and authorizing wire transfers for imported slate roofing and custom structural ironwork. I spent my afternoons physically sanding century-old heart pine floors until the muscles in my shoulders burned. I restored the chapel piece by careful piece. I reinforced the vaulted ceilings with concealed steel brackets capable of holding heavy floral installations. I rewired the entire estate to support the heavy electrical load of a full commercial catering kitchen and modern concert sound systems. I repointed the exterior stone with historically accurate mortar. I turned a decaying ruin into the most exclusive high-dollar event space in the county. Within 10 months of hard labor, Blue Ridge Heritage Holdings was appraised at just under $3 million, and my calendar was booked solid with premium clients. I kept this wealth entirely secret by deliberate choice. In my family, success is not celebrated unless it can be weaponized for social climbing. If my father discovered I owned a premier commercial venue, he would not congratulate my business acumen. He would immediately view the chapel as his own personal asset. He would expect free access to host his real estate networking galas to impress his wealthy clients. My mother would demand I host her endless charity luncheons at cost, treating my staff like her personal servants, and Caroline would use the estate as a free backdrop for her lifestyle brand, demanding priority over paying clients to shoot her sponsored content. My portfolio would be plundered to fund their hollow facade. By staying silent, I kept my sanctuary safe. I let them believe I was the struggling daughter renting a space for my own modest wedding. I let them believe I had scraped together a $5,000 deposit that they could easily force me to surrender. The morning after the dinner, the sun came up over the mountains, cutting through the thick morning fog. I poured a cup of black coffee and sat at my kitchen island. My phone vibrated against the cold granite countertop. It was a message from my mother Vivian. It was not a greeting. It was not a check on my emotional state after forcing me to cancel my wedding plans. It was an itemized list of administrative demands. I opened the message and read the cold, clinical text. Penelope. Since Caroline is taking over the October 14th date, we need to ensure the transition is seamless. Contact your caterer this morning and inform them the menu will change to match Preston's preferences. Call the rental company and upgrade the chair order to the gold Chiavari style. Have the venue coordinator forward the floor plan to Caroline's planner Sarah by noon. Send your deposit receipts to your father so he can review the financial transfer. We appreciate you handling this logistics work. I read the text twice. My mother was treating me not as a daughter who had just lost her wedding day, but as an unpaid administrative assistant. She expected me to do the heavy lifting of canceling my own dreams to facilitate my sister's theft. She expected me to manage the vendors, upgrade the orders, and neatly package the entire event so Caroline could simply walk in and take the credit without lifting a finger. I did not reply with anger. I did not call her to argue. Argument is a waste of oxygen when dealing with people who view you as property. Instead, I set my coffee mug down. I took a screenshot of the text message. I opened a new folder on my secure cloud drive, titled it Caroline Wedding Transition, and uploaded the image. I was letting the paper trail grow. Every demand, every assumption, every piece of evidence showing their coordinated effort to take over my booking was going into the file. The paperwork checkmate was beginning to assemble itself. I walked into my home office and opened the heavy fireproof safe hidden in the closet. I pulled out a thick manila folder containing the venue management protocols for Blue Ridge Heritage Holdings. Inside was the standard operating procedure for canceled events. According to the ironclad contract I had drafted with my own lawyer, any event canceled by the booking party forfeited the date immediately, returning the slot to the open market without exception. No transfers, no inherited bookings. I picked up my phone and drafted a reply to my mother. I kept the language brief, stripped of any emotion. I will not be managing the vendors. I have forwarded the venue contact information to Caroline's planner. Sarah can handle the transition directly with the property management office. I sent the message. Then I forwarded the public contact number for the Stone Chapel management office to Caroline's planner. The office was run by a sharp, highly efficient lawyer named Marcus, who acted as my property manager. Marcus did not know me as Penelope the sister. He knew me as the CEO of Blue Ridge Heritage Holdings. He operated strictly by the terms of the contracts I wrote. My phone buzzed again. Vivian replied with a single thumbs-up emoji accepting my compliance. She thought the matter was settled. She thought she had neatly rearranged her children to suit her social calendar. She had no idea that she had just sent a high-end wedding planner to negotiate with a brick wall. I closed the manila folder and slid it back into the safe. I locked the steel door. I checked my watch. It was 8 in the morning. Caroline's planner was known for her relentless efficiency. Sarah would likely call the venue management office the minute they opened at 9. The trap was set, baited with my family's own entitlement. I walked back into the kitchen, poured a second cup of coffee, and waited for the foundation of their perfect day to crumble. My phone rang at exactly 10:15. The caller ID displayed my mother's name. I let the device vibrate against the drafting table for 3 rings before I dragged my finger across the screen to answer. Vivian did not say hello. She bypassed all standard greetings, launching directly into the logistics of her new project. Her voice dripped with thick, manufactured Southern charm. It was the exact tone she deployed when soliciting premium donations for the Hospital Auxiliary Board. She called me darling, a term of endearment she reserved exclusively for moments when she intended to ask for money or manual labor. She explained that Caroline was feeling overwhelmed by the truncated timeline. Planning a high society wedding in 6 weeks was a heavy burden for a bride to carry. Therefore, Vivian had devised a solution that would benefit everyone. Since I had already vetted the caterer and secured the florist, it made perfect sense for Caroline to simply assume my vendor contracts. And since I was a supportive sister, Vivian suggested I gift my initial financial deposits to Caroline and Preston. She called it an engagement present. She called it a gesture of family unity. I sat in my quiet home office, listening to the sheer audacity of the request flow through the speakerphone. I looked at the architectural blueprints spread across my desk. The smell of cedar shavings and fresh ink filled the room. I calculated the exact financial sum my mother was demanding I surrender. $10,000 for the catering retainer, $8,000 for the floral design, $5,000 for the venue hold, $23,000 in total. That capital was generated through early mornings breathing plaster dust and late nights hauling heavy lumber. It was money I had earned through sheer physical endurance, all to be handed over as a tribute to my sister's fragile ego. Caroline did not just want my venue, she wanted my curated taste. The caterer I hired specialized in Appalachian farm-to-table cuisine, sourcing ingredients from local mountain farms. The florist was a rare native bloom specialist I had booked a year in advance. Caroline lacked the vision to build an event of that caliber, so she intended to simply step into the infrastructure I had built and claim it as her own. This was the third layer of their extraction. First, they took my date, then my location, and now my capital. My family operated like a parasitic organism, draining the host to sustain the golden child. For 28 years, they had expected me to act as the load-bearing column for Caroline's life. Whenever her foundation cracked, I was brought in to brace the walls. When she overspent her allowance in college, I paid her rent. When she damaged her expensive car, I took the city bus so she could drive my reliable sedan to her internship. I was expected to absorb the impact of her careless decisions to ensure her curated facade never showed a single fracture. I remembered the physical toll that expectation used to take on my body. The tight jaw, the burning stomach, the sleepless nights spent staring at the ceiling, wondering why my quiet sacrifices were never enough to earn their respect. I used to measure my worth by how much weight I could carry for them without complaining. But sitting at my drafting table, holding the phone away from my ear, I realized the pain was gone. The burning resentment had burned itself out, leaving only a clinical, cold clarity. You cannot feel betrayed by people who operate exactly according to their nature. A termite does not act out of spite when it eats through a floorboard. It merely consumes because that is what it is programmed to do. My mother was consuming my resources to feed her social ambitions. I did not feel angry. I felt awake. Vivian paused her monologue, waiting for my compliance. I kept my voice flat, devoid of any inflection. I told her I would release the vendor contracts. I told her I would authorize the venue transfer. Vivian exhaled a dramatic sigh of relief. She praised my generosity, stating she knew I would do the right thing to protect the family image. She instructed me to coordinate directly with Sarah Caroline's elite wedding planner. Sarah charged premium rates to manage high-profile events across the Carolinas, catering to clients who expected flawless execution. Vivian wanted me to hand the keys to Sarah so she could handle the transition without troubling Caroline with the administrative details. I told my mother I would email the authorization paperwork to Sarah within the hour. Vivian ended the call with a cheerful goodbye, already moving on to her next task. I set the phone down. I opened my laptop and drafted a formal email to Sarah. I attached the standard release form, a document I had drafted months ago for my holding company. As the supposed client Penelope Hayes, I was officially releasing my hold on the October 14th date. In the commercial event industry, a release date does not automatically transfer to a new party, especially at a premier location like the Stone Chapel. According to the ironclad policies I wrote for Blue Ridge Heritage Holdings, a canceled date triggers an immediate forfeiture. The system wipes the calendar clean. The date returns to the open market at a premium rate. There are no inherited bookings. There are no seamless transfers without a newly executed commercial contract approved by the property owner. I printed the release form. I picked up my heavy steel pen. I signed my name on the dotted line with deliberate, precise strokes. I was signing away my wedding day as a private citizen, which automatically triggered my legal rights as the corporate landlord. The ink dried on the crisp white paper. I scanned the document back into my computer. I attached it to the email addressed to Sarah. My finger hovered over the trackpad. I thought about the text message my father had sent the night before, threatening to exile me from holiday dinners if I embarrassed his future in-laws. I thought about Caroline smiling as she stole my wedding day. I thought about my mother demanding my hard-earned money with a polite smile. I clicked send. The email vanished from my outbox, speeding through the digital ether toward a planner who thought she was inheriting a fully prepared event. I leaned back in my ergonomic desk chair and looked out the window. The North Carolina sun was burning off the last of the morning fog, illuminating the distant peaks of the Blue Ridge Mountains. By now, Sarah was opening my email. She was downloading the release form. She was preparing to call the venue management office to introduce herself as the new coordinator for the October 14th date. She expected to speak with a compliant booking agent who would smoothly swap my name for Caroline's name on the existing file. She assumed her elite status in the wedding industry would guarantee a seamless transaction. She did not know she was about to collide with a legal firewall designed by the very sister her client was trying to erase. I poured myself a fresh glass of ice water and waited for the impact. I poured dark roast coffee into a ceramic mug as the morning sun crested the Blue Ridge Mountains, spilling pale gold light across my kitchen island. I stood barefoot on the cold oak floorboards, savoring the stillness of the house. David had left early for a faculty meeting, leaving me alone with the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the crisp scent of roasted beans. I took a slow sip of the hot liquid, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. I knew this tranquil environment was the last quiet hour I would experience for a very long time. At exactly 8:45, my phone began to vibrate against the granite countertop. It did not just buzz once. It rattled in a continuous, frantic rhythm, inching its way toward the edge of the counter like a panicked insect. I set my mug down and looked at the glowing screen. There were 14 unread text messages. All of them were from my older sister. The curated, polished persona Caroline usually projected had vanished, replaced by sheer, unfiltered panic. The messages were typed in capital letters, riddled with typographical errors. She demanded to know what I had done. She asked why her planner was crying. She ordered me to answer the phone immediately. The digital barrage was a sharp contrast to the patronizing heart emoji she had sent the night prior. The facade was cracking. I did not reply. I locked the screen and leaned against the counter, tracing the rim of my coffee mug with my index finger. I pictured the exact sequence of events that had just unfolded in the opulent downtown office of Caroline's elite wedding planner. Sarah operated out of a high-rise suite in Charlotte, surrounded by fabric swatches and imported floral catalogs. She was accustomed to dealing with compliant vendors who bent over backward to accommodate her high-profile clients. Promptly at 8:30, Sarah would have dialed the number for the property management office of Blue Ridge Heritage Holdings, expecting a routine administrative task. She likely held her expensive pen over a fresh legal pad, ready to cross my name out and write Caroline's name in its place. Instead, my property manager, Marcus, answered the line. Marcus is a former corporate litigator who speaks exclusively in contract clauses. When Sarah cheerily announced she was taking over the October 14th date for the Hayes family, Marcus would have pulled up the file, he would have viewed the release form I submitted, and he would have informed Sarah in a flat, unyielding tone that the booking was officially terminated. I imagined Sarah's confusion. She would have explained the situation using her elite status as leverage, insisting it was merely a family transfer. Marcus would have cut her off. He operates strictly by the book. He would have recited the cancellation policy I authored. Any event released by the original booking party triggers an immediate forfeiture. The date does not transfer. It returns to the open market at the current premium rate, which was now double what I had originally paid. The owner of the venue had pulled the date entirely. Sarah would have demanded to speak with the owner. Marcus would have declined, stating the holding company prefers to remain anonymous. When Sarah threatened to ruin the venue's reputation in the local bridal industry, Marcus would have calmly reminded her that tortious interference with a commercial entity carries severe financial penalties. He would have then terminated the call, leaving Sarah to dial Caroline and deliver the devastating news. The premier location was gone. The October 14th date was erased. My phone stopped vibrating for a brief moment, then the screen illuminated again. This time the caller ID displayed my mother's name. Vivian was calling. I swiped the green button and raised the phone to my ear. I did not say a word. I let her speak first. The manufactured Southern charm she had wielded yesterday was entirely absent. Vivian bypassed pleasantries and launched into a shrill, breathless tirade. The pitch of her voice was high and tight, lacking its usual polished refinement. She sounded like a woman watching her prized crystal shatter on a tile floor. "Penelope, what is happening?" Vivian demanded, her breath hitched through the speaker. "Sarah just called Caroline in tears. The management office at the Stone Chapel is claiming your booking is canceled. They are refusing to honor the family transfer. They told Sarah the date is gone. You need to call your contact there right now and fix this clerical error." I listened to the frantic edge in her voice. For 28 years, that specific tone had been my cue to leap into action. Whenever my mother raised her voice, I was conditioned to apologize, to smooth over the rough edges, to sacrifice my own comfort to restore the peace of the household. I was the fixer. I was the structural support beam. But standing in my sunlit kitchen holding the phone, I felt no urge to fix anything. I felt only the solid, unyielding ground beneath my feet. I watched a cardinal land on the branch of the oak tree outside my window. The world outside was quiet and steady. "They did not make a clerical error, Mother," I said. My voice was calm, pitched low and even. I kept my breathing measured. Vivian scoffed a sharp, dismissive sound. "Of course it is an error, Penelope. You sent them the release form. They just filed it incorrectly. Call them back and demand they reinstate the date under Caroline's name. Threaten to pull your catering contract if you have to. We do not have time for this incompetence. Preston's parents are expecting a finalized venue address by tomorrow evening." I let her finish her frantic instructions. I let the silence stretch over the line for 3 long seconds. I wanted her to hear the weight of my next words. "I did not make a mistake," I said. "I canceled it." The silence that followed was profound. It was not just a pause in the conversation. It was the sound of a tectonic shift. It was the exact moment a power dynamic that had defined our family for nearly 3 decades fractured and collapsed. The heavy invisible yoke I had carried for my entire life slipped off my shoulders and hit the floor. "Excuse me," Vivian whispered. The shrill demands had evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp shock. "You told me to release the venue," I replied, maintaining that terrifying clinical calm. "You said my wedding was an inconvenience. You ordered me to step aside. So I did exactly what you asked. I canceled my wedding. The venue policy is strict. Canceled dates are forfeited. There are no transfers. The date is gone, Mother." "But you are family," she sputtered, her voice rising again, desperate to find a foothold in the collapsing conversation. "You tell them you are family. You tell them you need that date back." "They do not care about our family," I said. "They only care about the contract, and the contract is terminated. Good luck finding a new location in 6 weeks." I pulled the phone away from my ear and tapped the red button. The call disconnected. I set the device face down on the granite counter. I did not tremble. I did not cry. I picked up my coffee mug and took another sip. The dark roast tasted rich and bitter. A deep, profound sense of peace washed over me. For the first time in my existence, I held the reins. I was no longer the compliant, invisible sister, fetching the tonic and smoothing the wrinkles. I had drawn a hard boundary, and I had built it out of solid masonry and ironclad legal clauses. My phone vibrated again. Another call from Vivian. Then a call from my father, Richard. The notification stacked up on the screen, a digital manifestation of their unraveling world. I reached over and flipped the silent switch on the side of the device. The rattling stopped. I knew the silence would not last. People who are accustomed to taking whatever they want do not surrender after one phone call. My father was a man who measured his life by his ability to intimidate others into submission. He would not accept defeat from the daughter he viewed as a blue-collar disappointment. He would view my refusal as a direct challenge to his authority. When a phone call fails, men like Richard resort to physical presence. They use their height, their loud voices, and their commanding posture to force compliance. I looked at the heavy wooden front door of my house. The deadbolt was thrown, but a locked door rarely stops entitled people from demanding entry. They were going to demand answers. They were going to try to bully me into using my imaginary construction connections to beg the property owner for a favor. I walked over to my hall closet and pulled out the thick manila folder holding the original property deed. I set it on the entryway table. I was ready for them to drive up my mountain. Exactly 54 minutes after I disconnected the call, the heavy tires of a silver luxury SUV crunched over the gravel of my driveway. The vehicle did not ease to a polite stop. It braked hard, throwing small stones against the wooden skirt of my house. I recognized the vehicle immediately. It was my father's prized possession, a rolling status symbol he used to project dominance when visiting commercial development sites. Richard did not drive up the mountain to have a conversation. He drove up here to issue a command. I picked up the manila folder from the entryway table and stepped outside. I closed the heavy oak front door behind me and locked the deadbolt. I stood on the elevated wraparound porch. I had framed this porch myself 3 years ago, measuring the joists and securing the decking with galvanized screws. It sat 4 feet above the ground, creating a distinct physical elevation. It was my boundary. I stood near the top of the wooden stairs, holding the folder at my side, and watched my parents exit their vehicle. Richard slammed his door. He wore a tailored navy suit and polished leather shoes, attire wholly unsuited for the rural mountain terrain. He was a tall man who walked with the forward momentum of a falling tree, accustomed to people scrambling out of his path. Vivian trailed half a step behind him, her face tight and pale beneath her pristine makeup. The manufactured Southern charm was gone. She looked like a woman who had just realized her social calendar was disintegrating. My father stopped at the base of the stairs. He placed one hand on the wooden railing but did not climb the steps. He looked up at me, his jaw set in a hard line. "We are not playing games today," Penelope Richard said. His voice was a low, resonant rumble honed from decades of intimidating junior brokers in boardrooms. "You are going to fix the mess you made this morning." I looked down at him from my elevated position. I did not shift my weight. I did not break eye contact. "There is no mess," I replied, keeping my tone flat and unyielding. "The contract was terminated. The policy is standard industry practice." Richard scoffed a harsh sound that echoed in the crisp mountain air. "Do not quote policy to me. You work in the dirt. I own the development market in this county. I know how these property holding companies operate. They rely on local goodwill to keep their zoning permits clean." He took a step up the stairs, attempting to bridge the vertical gap between us. I remained entirely still. He stopped on the second tread, realizing I was not going to retreat toward the door. "Sarah told us the management office claimed the owner pulled the date," Vivian interjected, her voice sharp and frantic. She clutched her designer handbag against her chest. "She said the owner is remaining anonymous. We know you work with these historic restoration investors. You know these people. You probably sanded the floors in that chapel yourself." Richard nodded, seizing on the false narrative. "You are going to call whoever hired you to restore that property. You are going to use whatever meager construction connections you have and cash in a favor. Tell the owner it was a clerical error. Tell them your father will owe them a favor. I do not care what leverage you have to invent. You will get that date back by sundown." "And if I decline?" I asked. Richard narrowed his eyes. The paternal mask fell away entirely, leaving only the ruthless businessman. "If you refuse to correct this, I will make sure you never swing a hammer in this county again," he stated. His voice was cold, stripped of any familial warmth. "I sit on the Regional Commerce Board. I know every commercial developer and Heritage Foundation director from here to Charlotte. I will blacklist your contracting business. I will starve you out of the market. You will be fixing drywall in cheap apartment complexes by the end of the year." I stood on my porch listening to the man who contributed half my DNA threaten to destroy my livelihood over a party. He assumed I was a vulnerable laborer, reliant on his good graces and the scraps of the local elite. He viewed my career as a fragile, dispensable hobby. I looked at the manila folder in my left hand. The North Carolina breeze caught the edge of the paper inside. "You do not need to call the Regional Commerce Board," I said. My voice was quiet, yet it carried an unmistakable density. "And I do not need to call in a favor from the owner." I opened the folder. I pulled out a single sheet of heavy, watermarked paper. It was the recorded warranty deed for the Stone Chapel estate. The document bore the raised seal of the county registrar and the bold, notarized signature of the holding company executive. I held the document out, keeping it just beyond his reach. "I am the owner," I said. Richard stared at the paper. For a long moment, the mountain breeze was the only sound. He did not speak, his eyes locked on to the black ink. I watched his mind process the data. I watched the patriarchal arrogance drain from his posture, replaced by cold, calculating arithmetic. He was a real estate broker. He knew how to read a county deed. He saw the legal description of the 12-acre commercial parcel. He saw the name of my holding company, Blue Ridge Heritage Holdings. He saw my signature listed as the sole managing member. "The chapel is not a contracting gig," I explained, delivering the metrics with surgical precision. "It is a commercial asset. I purchased the property out of foreclosure 14 months ago. I funded the renovation with my own capital. The estate appraised last week at nearly $3 million. I hold the title free and clear." Vivian let out a small, breathless gasp. She looked from the paper to my face, her eyes wide with uncomprehending shock. $3 million? She whispered the number, echoing in her mind as she translated it into country club currency. Richard did not gasp. his face turned a pale ashen shade. The man who had just threatened to starve me out of the market was rapidly calculating the financial reality of the document in front of him. He was realizing that the daughter he routinely dismissed as an administrative afterthought held an asset worth more than his entire brokerage firm. He was realizing he possessed zero leverage. I did not make a clerical error. I continued, my voice steady and unhurried. When you demanded I surrender my wedding date to accommodate Caroline, I complied. I canceled my personal reservation. As the property owner, I enforce a strict forfeiture policy. The October 14th date is currently being marketed to premium corporate clients at double the standard rate. Caroline is not getting the venue. You are not getting the venue. "You cannot do this," Vivian stammered, stepping forward and gripping Richard's arm. "You are her mother. You have an obligation to this family." "My obligation to this family ended when you told me to cancel my wedding or face exile," I replied. I stepped back, lowering the deed and sliding it safely into the manila folder. "You demanded I step aside. I stepped aside. The transition is complete." Richard closed his mouth. He looked at the sturdy wooden beams of my porch, perhaps noticing for the first time the structural integrity of the home I had built. He looked at my calloused hands, the hands he had mocked, holding the proof of my financial independence. He had nothing left to say. There was no threat he could levy that would penetrate the fortress I had constructed. "Get in the car, Vivian," Richard ordered. His voice was hollow, stripped of its resonant power. He turned around and walked down the gravel driveway, his posture rigid and diminished. He did not look back. Vivian lingered for a fraction of a second, opening her mouth as if to try one last emotional manipulation, but the sheer coldness in my eyes stopped her. She turned and hurried after her husband, her heels sinking into the dirt. I stood on the porch and watched the silver luxury SUV reverse out of my driveway. The tires spun in the gravel, lacking their initial confident traction. I watched them drive down the mountain until they disappeared around the bend. I closed the folder and walked back inside my house, turning the deadbolt behind me. The initial ambush was over. I had drawn the boundary and defended it with ironclad documentation. But as I set the deed on the kitchen counter, I knew the silence would be temporary. People who measure their lives in social status do not retreat gracefully when they are humiliated. They adapt. They change their tactics. My father had realized he could not break my financial foundation, which meant my mother and sister would soon target the only other currency they understood. The Whisper campaign was about to begin, and the high society circles of North Carolina were about to receive a very curated, toxic narrative. When you strip a man of his financial leverage, he will inevitably reach for the next available weapon. In North Carolina high society, that weapon is reputation. My father recognized he could not seize my commercial property through intimidation, so he handed the reins of the campaign over to my mother. Vivian was a master architect of social warfare. For 3 decades, she had cultivated her status among the charity boards and country club committees of Asheville, treating gossip as a high-yield currency. She knew exactly how to dismantle a person without ever raising her voice. The retaliation began on a Tuesday, 72 hours after I ordered them off my porch. Vivian and Caroline initiated a synchronized whisper campaign, deploying a highly curated narrative designed to isolate me. They did not tell their peers that I owned a multi-million-dollar estate and had evicted them for entitlement. The truth did not serve their aesthetic. Instead, they spun a story of tragic, unhinged jealousy. The narrative spread through the tennis pavilions and luncheon tables with ruthless efficiency. According to my mother, the physical toll of my blue-collar construction work had finally triggered a mental breakdown. I was painted as the bitter, struggling younger sister who simply could not handle the pressure of planning a wedding alongside Caroline's grand society affair. Vivian told her friends, dabbing her eyes with a linen napkin, that I had canceled my own wedding in a sudden fit of hysteria, attempting to ruin Caroline's happiness out of spite. They weaponized Southern etiquette to destroy my character. In this culture, open hostility is considered gauche. True warfare is conducted under the guise of deep concern. The effects of the campaign materialized in my digital inbox by Wednesday afternoon. I received an email from my Aunt Margaret, my father's sister, who lived in a gated community in Raleigh. The subject line read, "Thinking of you in this dark time." I sat at my kitchen island and read the message on my laptop screen. Aunt Margaret wrote that the entire extended family was praying for my mental health. She suggested I seek professional counseling to deal with my unresolved resentment toward my sister. She stated it was heartbreaking to watch me sabotage my own life just to hurt Caroline, who had done nothing but try to include me in her joy. She ended the email with a familiar regional phrase, "Bless your heart," a sequence of words designed to deliver a lethal dose of condescension wrapped in false pity. Over the next 48 hours, similar messages arrived from cousins and old family friends. Some offered unsolicited recommendations for therapists. Others sent passive inquiries about David, wondering if my steady fiancé was going to tolerate my unstable behavior. I watched the notifications stack up a digital ledger of every relative who chose to believe the easiest lie rather than ask me for the truth. I experienced the sting of being alienated. It is a profound, unique ache to realize that your blood relatives will gladly discard your character to protect the golden child. I felt the sharp urge to defend myself, to draft a mass email containing the property deed and the screenshots of my mother's initial demands. I wanted to burn their false narrative to the ground with empirical data. I drafted a response to Aunt Margaret. I typed out the exact timeline of the venue theft. I detailed the financial reality of my holding company. I wrote 3 paragraphs of undeniable proof. Then I looked at the flashing cursor. I highlighted the text and hit the delete key. I closed my laptop. I understood that fighting a rumor with emotion only validates the instigator's premise. If I sent an angry defensive email, Vivian would print it out and pass it around the country club as proof of my hysteria. She wanted me to react. She needed me to act erratically to cement the foundation of her lie. I chose the strategy of the vacuum. When you refuse to supply oxygen to a fire, it eventually burns itself out. Silence is the most terrifying response you can give to a narcissist because it deprives them of the reflection they crave. I did not reply to Aunt Margaret. I did not block my cousins. I simply let their messages sit unanswered in the digital void. I let them exhaust their own venom. Instead of defending my reputation to people who were committed to misunderstanding me, I channeled my energy into the physical reality of my estate. The stone chapel required my attention. I had premium corporate clients scheduled to tour the property the following week, and the architectural finishes needed to be pristine. I drove my truck up the winding mountain road to the chapel gates. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine needles and damp earth. I unlocked the heavy iron doors and stepped into the sanctuary. The morning light poured through the restored stained glass, casting fractured patterns of ruby and cobalt across the polished heart pine floorboards. I spent the next 4 days immersed in metric-driven labor. I installed the final antique brass hardware on the heavy mahogany reception doors, ensuring the strike plates were aligned to the millimeter. I applied a specialized linseed oil compound to the exposed stone walls in the catering kitchen, sealing the porous rock against moisture. I measured cut and secured custom oak wainscoting in the bridal suite using a pneumatic nail gun with rhythmic precision. The work grounded me. A rumor cannot alter the load-bearing capacity of a steel beam. Social ostracization cannot unseal a perfectly leveled floor. I found quiet dignity in the tangible results of my labor, trusting the solid architecture around me while my family spun their fragile web of gossip. While I was securing hardware and polishing glass, Caroline was spiraling into a logistical nightmare. October in the Blue Ridge Mountains is the zenith of the wedding and tourism season. The vibrant autumn foliage draws thousands of visitors, and every premium event space, rustic barn, and luxury hotel ballroom is booked 3 years in advance. The inventory of high society venues was zero. Caroline had exactly 5 weeks to find a location capable of accommodating 300 wealthy guests from Geneva and Charlotte. Through the quiet network of local vendors, I heard the echoes of her desperation. My caterer, whom I had released from his contract, texted me to share that Caroline's planner had called him in a panic, begging for a lead on any canceled dates in the region. Sarah was calling country clubs 2 counties over, trying to bribe booking agents to bump other brides. Caroline's curated digital feed went entirely silent. There were no pastel brunch photos or smiling engagement updates. The facade of the effortless, glowing bride was crumbling behind closed doors as the ticking clock amplified her panic. She had stolen my date, assuming she was inheriting a fully engineered event. Instead, she found herself holding an empty calendar on the busiest weekend of the year. The societal warfare my mother waged had successfully alienated me from the extended family, but it did not produce a venue. Gossip does not print a catering menu. Rumors do not erect a reception tent. My parents soon realized that freezing me out of their social circle was a failed strategy. I was not bending under the weight of their disapproval. I was not crawling back to the formal dining room to beg for their forgiveness. I was thriving in the silence. Richard recognized that the social pressure had collapsed. If Caroline did not secure a venue soon, the prominent Geneva family would begin to ask questions, and his strategic alliance would fracture. He needed the stone chapel. He needed my property. And since intimidation and isolation had proven ineffective, my father decided to shift his tactics from the country club to the courtroom. I was standing on a ladder in the chapel foyer, adjusting the chain of an iron chandelier, when my phone vibrated in the pocket of my denim work pants. I ignored it, focused on balancing the heavy fixture. 10 minutes later, I climbed down and retrieved the device. I had a missed call from my fiancé David. I also had a notification from my home security system. The camera mounted on my front porch had captured a delivery. I opened the video application and watched a uniformed courier step onto my wooden deck. The courier approached my front door, attached a thick, heavy envelope to the brass knocker, captured a photograph for proof of delivery, and walked away. I zoomed in on the paused video frame. The envelope bore the distinct embossed logo of my father's high-power corporate law firm. The social campaign was over. The financial extortion attempt had arrived at my doorstep. I left the heavy iron doors of the stone chapel locked and drove my truck down the steep mountain road to retrieve the package from my front porch. The drive took 20 minutes. I gripped the steering wheel, calculating the potential risks. When I arrived home, the thick envelope was waiting exactly where the security camera had captured it. I picked it up. It felt dense, heavy, with legal posturing and expensive intimidation. I did not open it in my kitchen. I treated the document like a volatile chemical spill. I needed a sterile environment to examine the contents. I drove straight into downtown Asheville, navigating the narrow historic streets until I reached the sleek glass-paneled building that housed the office of my corporate attorney, Marcus. Marcus was a former litigator who managed the legal framework for Blue Ridge Heritage Holdings. He sat behind a solid mahogany desk in a room that smelled of polished wood and fresh espresso. He wore a crisp gray suit and maintained an expression of perpetual calm. I walked into his office, bypassed the small talk, and handed him the sealed envelope. He took it without a word, reached for a silver letter opener, and sliced through the thick paper. He extracted 3 pages of dense legal jargon printed on the premium watermarked letterhead of my father's high-power law firm. Marcus read the document in silence. His eyes tracked back and forth across the paragraphs with surgical precision. I sat in a leather guest chair across from him, monitoring his posture, waiting for a sign of genuine concern. I listened to the faint hum of the air conditioning vent overhead. Marcus did not frown. He did not reach for his reference books. Instead, he let out a short, dry sound that resembled a cough but was actually a laugh. He placed the pages on his desk and slid them across the polished wood toward me, shaking his head. I picked up the pages and read the text. The document was a formal cease and desist order, and it contained a breathtaking leap of logic. My father's attorney had drafted a claim stating that because Richard had paid my undergraduate college tuition 10 years ago, he had essentially provided the initial seed capital for my entire architectural restoration career. Therefore, the letter argued, Richard possessed an equitable vested interest in Blue Ridge Heritage Holdings. The document demanded that I surrender the stone chapel for the weekend of October 14th as a mandatory dividend payment to satisfy his initial investment. The letter concluded with a stark threat, promising that a failure to comply would result in immediate litigation designed to freeze my corporate assets and halt all commercial operations at the estate. I looked up at Marcus, waiting for his professional assessment. He folded his hands together and leaned back in his chair. He explained that equitable interest requires signed partnership agreements, capital contribution receipts linked directly to the specific corporate entity, and a mountain of notarized documentation. Paying a child's university tuition does not magically grant a parent equity in their future commercial real estate ventures. Marcus stated the document was nothing but a hollow scare tactic. He called it a piece of paper that possessed the legal force of a wish. It was a bluff drafted by a lawyer who was being paid an exorbitant hourly rate to panic an uninformed citizen into surrendering a prime asset. I sat back in the leather chair, letting the cool air condition wash over me. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling window at the Asheville skyline. I did not feel panic. I did not feel the familiar childhood dread that usually accompanied my father's wrath. I felt a cold, sudden understanding. I analyzed the metrics of my father's behavior. Richard was a calculating, pragmatic man. He understood property law. He knew this cease and desist was legally void. A man with a solid financial foundation does not pay an attorney thousands of dollars to draft a frivolous, unenforceable threat. He only throws a wild, desperate punch when he is cornered and running out of oxygen. I mentally reviewed the state of the regional commercial market over the past 3 quarters. Interest rates had climbed steadily. Several large retail developments in the county had stalled, leaving unfinished steel frames rusting in the rain. Richard's brokerage firm specialized in those exact commercial sectors. I recalled small, subtle details from the past few months that I had previously ignored. Richard had stopped drinking his imported scotch at family dinners, opting for a generic brand. Vivian had worn the same designer gown to 3 consecutive charity galas, a fashion repetition she would normally consider a cardinal sin. The pieces snapped together with sharp clarity. My family was not just toxic, they were financially overextended. Richard was drowning in leveraged debt, struggling to maintain the illusion of wealth while his firm bled cash. Caroline marrying Preston was never merely about social prestige. Preston's family owned an international logistics empire in Geneva. They possessed vast reserves of liquid capital. The upcoming wedding was a strategic corporate merger disguised as a romantic union. Richard needed the alliance to secure a financial lifeline for his crumbling brokerage. If Caroline failed to secure a premium venue and the prestigious wedding unraveled, the Geneva investors would likely cancel the alliance. Richard was panicking because his entire financial foundation was collapsing beneath his expensive leather shoes. The realization stripped away any lingering traces of familial guilt. They were not trying to secure a pretty backdrop for a party. They were trying to steal my property to save their own sinking ship, and they expected me to drown so they could stay afloat. I picked up the cease and desist letter. I placed it inside the thick manila folder I carried in my leather work bag. That folder was rapidly becoming a tangible archive of their unraveling. It held the screenshots of my mother's initial demands, the vendor release forms, the original property deed, and now a documented attempt at financial extortion. The manila folder was my shield and my sword. Every piece of paper they sent me only reinforced the steel walls of my defense, proving their desperate intent. Marcus asked if I wanted him to draft a formal legal response, refuting their claims and demanding they halt their harassment. I considered the option, evaluating the strategic outcome. I told him a formal response from a lawyer would only signal that I took their threat seriously. It would grant my father the engagement he desperately craved, validating his delusion that we were negotiating. I did not want to negotiate. I wanted to shut the iron gate. I pulled my mobile phone from my pocket. I unlocked the screen and opened my text messages. I navigated to the active thread with my father. I did not type a paragraph explaining the legal flaws in his document. I did not list the reasons his logic failed. I typed a single, concise line. See you in court, or see you never. I hit send. I listened to the faint digital swoop as the message delivered. I placed the phone back in my pocket. I closed the manila folder and thanked Marcus for his expert counsel. I stood up, shook his hand, and walked out of the sleek glass office. I stepped onto the bustling sidewalk, taking a deep breath of the crisp autumn air. I had neutralized the legal assault with 0 casualties on my side of the ledger. The war with my blood relatives had reached a stalemate, but the narrative of my life was about to shift fronts. While my biological parents were busy forging crude weapons out of financial desperation, a different set of people were currently navigating the interstate highway toward my home. David had left a voicemail while I was sitting in the meeting. His parents were arriving in town tonight, driving up from their quiet suburb to help us prepare for whatever kind of wedding we managed to salvage. I was about to experience a profound, jarring contrast between the family I shared DNA with and the chosen family I was actively building. I navigated the winding asphalt roads back toward my property as the setting sun painted the Appalachian sky in shades of bruised purple and dull orange. When I pulled my truck into the gravel driveway, a faded blue sedan was parked near the front steps. David stood near the open trunk, unloading a battered canvas duffel bag. Beside him stood his parents, Martha and Thomas. They had driven 4 hours from their quiet suburban neighborhood to help us prepare for whatever version of a wedding we managed to salvage. I turned off the engine and stepped out into the crisp evening air. Thomas wore comfortable walking shoes and a faded flannel shirt. He had spent 40 years managing a municipal water treatment facility, building a career based on maintaining invisible, essential infrastructure. Martha was a retired pediatric nurse. She possessed a quiet, observant kindness, moving with the efficient grace of a woman who had spent decades soothing frightened children. They did not announce their arrival with loud complaints about the mountain traffic. They did not critique the rustic exterior of my home. They simply walked over and greeted me with warm, firm embraces that smelled of peppermint and clean laundry. Martha reached into the back seat of their modest sedan and retrieved a heavy object wrapped in thick kitchen towels. She peeled back the striped cotton fabric to reveal a scratched glass baking dish filled with homemade baked ziti. The cheese was bubbling at the edges, emitting a rich, savory aroma of roasted garlic, crushed tomatoes, and Italian herbs. She handed the warm glass container to me, stating they figured David and I would be too exhausted to cook after dealing with the recent legal drama. I held the heavy dish against my chest, letting the heat seep through my denim jacket. My mind immediately flashed to the elaborate dinners my own mother hosted. Vivian regularly hired white-coated catering staffs to serve intricate culinary sculptures on fragile bone china. Her meals were never designed to provide genuine nourishment. They were calculated social investments, deployed specifically to extract favors and elevate her status among the charity board directors. Every single bite of food consumed in my parents' formal dining room came with an invisible invoice attached. Martha's pasta contained 0 hidden fees. It was just a meal given freely because her son and his fiancée were hungry. We walked inside and gathered around my solid oak dining table. I portioned the baked pasta onto plain ceramic plates while David poured tall glasses of iced tea. We sat down and Thomas asked how the event preparations were progressing, given the sudden change in circumstances. I set my fork down on the wooden table. I looked across at David, and he gave me a small, encouraging nod. I opened the thick manila folder resting on the adjacent counter and placed my recorded property deed on the table between our plates. Over the next 20 minutes, I explained the entire sequence of events with metric-driven precision. I detailed the theft of my original date, the hostile porch ambush, the country club whisper campaign, and the recent cease and desist order delivered by the corporate courier. I braced myself for their reaction. In my biological family, bad news triggered shrieking, accusations, dramatic tears, or immediate demands for retaliatory public scenes to protect the family reputation. Martha wiped her mouth with a paper napkin. She looked at the notarized deed, then looked directly into my eyes. Her expression held no pity, no judgment, and no theatrical outrage. There was only a steady, unwavering acceptance. Thomas took another bite of his dinner, chewed thoughtfully, and swallowed. He did not ask what I had done to provoke my father's wrath. He did not suggest we compromise to save face and keep the peace. Thomas simply asked what time we needed to arrive at the estate tomorrow morning to finish the architectural trim work. He mentioned he had brought his own variable speed belt sander and a specialized set of woodworking chisels in the trunk of his car. Martha added that she possessed an excellent technique for polishing antique brass fixtures without scratching the underlying metal. I sat in my chair, rendered entirely speechless. They did not view my crisis as a social liability. They saw a structural problem and immediately volunteered to help reinforce the load-bearing walls. I experienced a profound internal shift in that quiet kitchen. For 28 years, I believed affection was a ledger. I thought loyalty was a premium commodity I had to purchase through constant compliance, financial sacrifice, and manual labor. I assumed I always owed a debt just for existing in the same room as my relatives. Sitting across from Thomas and Martha, I realized genuine love operates without a balance sheet. You do not have to buy your seat at their table. They just pull up a chair and ask if you want extra sauce. The next morning, the 4 of us drove my heavy-duty work truck up the steep grade to the stone chapel. The crisp autumn air filled the sanctuary as we unlocked the heavy mahogany doors. For 6 hours, we worked in harmonious, productive silence. The echo of our tools filled the vaulted space, a rhythm of creation rather than destruction. Thomas helped David secure the final steel brackets on the exposed timber trusses, ensuring the ceiling could easily support the weight of the upcoming floral installations. Martha stood beside me in the bridal suite, applying a smooth, protective coat of tung oil to the custom oak wainscoting I had installed the week prior. We did not discuss the toxic country club gossip. We did not dissect my mother's psychological flaws. We talked about soil testing methods for Martha's backyard garden and the superior durability of vintage hand tools. I looked around the sunlit room, breathing in the clean scent of fresh wood shavings and citrus solvent. The rigid tension that had gripped my spine for a week finally dissolved, melting away into the restored floorboards. I realized my core motivation had fundamentally changed. I was no longer fighting my biological parents out of spite. Spite is a hollow, exhausting fuel that eventually burns through your own engine. I was fighting to protect the sacred peace of this new family. I had built an architectural fortress, and now I finally had people worth sheltering inside it. I would not allow Vivian or Richard to contaminate this sanctuary with their transactional cruelty. We finished the trim work by early afternoon. The chapel interior glowed with quiet historic dignity. I told David and his parents to take a break while I walked out to the gravel parking area to retrieve a box of brass door hinges from my truck bed. I lowered the tailgate and reached for the cardboard box. My mobile phone chimed from my denim pocket. I wiped the tung oil off my hands with a shop rag and retrieved the device. The caller ID displayed the name of my premier caterer, a highly sought-after farm-to-table chef named Elias. I answered the call, expecting a routine question about the updated tasting menu schedule we had planned for next week. Instead, Elias sounded confused and significantly agitated. He bypassed his usual cheerful greeting. He asked why I had just called his office from a blocked number, attempting to cancel my entire menu order and demanding an immediate full refund of my $10,000 catering retainer. I stood beside the lowered tailgate of my work truck, holding my phone against my ear. The autumn wind swept across the gravel parking lot, carrying the sharp scent of crushed, dry leaves and cold metal. I listened to Elias, my premier caterer, repeat his frantic question. He wanted to know why I had just called his commercial kitchen from an unknown number, demanding the immediate cancellation of my wedding menu and requesting a full refund of my $10,000 retainer. I did not interrupt him. I let him explain the strange interaction. Elias stated the woman on the line sounded frantic. She claimed a sudden family emergency forced a change of plans. She possessed my full name, the date of the event, and the exact financial figures of the deposit. However, she made a critical logistical error. The caller instructed Elias to mail the refund check to a different address in Asheville, one that did not match the billing profile on his merchant ledger. Elias is a meticulous professional. He sources heirloom vegetables from small mountain farms and prepares farm-raised quail with locally harvested honey. A chef who monitors the exact temperature of a roasting oven does not wire $10,000 to an unverified address without asking questions. He told the caller he needed to process the cancellation through his accounting software and would call her back. Then he immediately dialed my direct cellular number. I leaned against the cold steel of my truck. I told Elias I had not called his kitchen. I assured him the wedding was proceeding exactly as planned, and the menu remained unchanged. Elias exhaled a long breath, the tension leaving his voice. He realized someone had just attempted to impersonate his client. He asked how someone could possess such detailed knowledge of my private vendor contracts. I knew exactly who placed the call. Caroline had spent her entire life expecting the world to yield to her preferences. When my father failed to secure the stone chapel through legal extortion, she panicked. The ticking clock of her own approaching wedding date had finally shattered her curated, flawless facade. She was running out of options, so she resorted to sabotage. She wanted to dismantle my infrastructure, hoping to reclaim the deposited funds to finance a desperate last-minute venue search for herself. She assumed Elias would simply process the request. She viewed service industry professionals as nameless workers who existed only to execute orders. She did not understand the architecture of professional loyalty. Elias did not cancel my order because I was not merely a bride planning a single party. I was a structural pillar of his annual revenue. Months prior, I had selected his culinary firm as the exclusive catering partner for a high-profile corporate retreat at the Stone Chapel. The event was hosted by an online channel named Linda Vengeance, a digital broadcasting network that booked the estate for a sprawling 7-day creative summit. That single contract infused his business with a 6-figure profit margin. Our working relationship was built on mutual financial respect and reliable execution. He knew I operated with metric-driven precision. He knew I would never call from a blocked number and demand a hastily rerouted check. Before I could finish reassuring Elias, my phone vibrated against my cheek. I pulled the device away and looked at the screen. Clara, my botanical designer, was calling on the second line. I told Elias to ignore any further communication from anyone other than me. I swapped the calls. Clara bypassed her usual cheerful greeting. She cultivated rare native blooms in specialized temperature-controlled greenhouses. Her voice sounded strained. She asked if I was experiencing a financial crisis. She stated a woman claiming to be me had just called her studio, attempting to cancel the custom trillium and ghost orchid installations. The caller cited a sudden budget collapse and demanded the $8,000 floral retainer be refunded to a new routing number. The pattern was verified. Caroline was systematically working her way through the vendor list I had provided to her planner days ago. She was committing coordinated fraud across multiple commercial accounts. I instructed Clara to secure the order and disregard the fraudulent call. I disconnected the line and stood in the quiet mountain air. I did not feel a sudden rush of anger. I felt a profound, heavy sadness. I looked out at the rolling peaks of the Blue Ridge Mountains, analyzing the tragic trajectory of my older sister. Caroline was a woman who had built her entire identity on the perception of wealth and moral superiority. She posted daily affirmations about grace and elegance to her thousands of digital followers. Yet under the pressure of losing a single social event, she was willing to stoop to common theft. She was willing to impersonate another citizen, risking her freedom over a party. It was a pathetic display of moral bankruptcy. I could have called my parents and screamed at them. I could have driven to Caroline's townhouse and confronted her on her front lawn. But theatrical confrontations only feed the ego of the narcissist. They thrive on the drama, using your raised voice as proof of your instability. I do not engage in screaming matches. I engage in paperwork. I unlocked my truck and climbed into the driver's seat. I connected my phone to the Bluetooth interface and dialed Marcus, my corporate attorney. He answered on the second ring. I delivered the facts with cold efficiency. I detailed the 2 attempted fraudulent cancellations. I provided the timestamps of the calls and the exact financial sums Caroline attempted to divert into her own accounts. Marcus did not laugh this time. His tone shifted into the sharp, predatory cadence of a former litigator. Impersonating an individual to divert funds across state or commercial lines was not a trivial family dispute. It was a statutory offense. I told Marcus I did not want to file a police report today. I wanted to build a boundary so terrifying that Caroline would never dare cross it again. I instructed him to draft a formal legal notice of criminal intent. We spent the next 20 minutes outlining the document. It would not resemble the hollow, equitable interest letter my father had sent. This document would be forged from undeniable penal codes. Marcus cited specific North Carolina statutes. He detailed the exact parameters of obtaining property by false pretenses. He outlined the legal definitions of identity theft and commercial wire fraud. The letter explicitly stated that any further attempts to contact vendors associated with Blue Ridge Heritage Holdings would result in the immediate submission of sworn affidavits to the county district attorney. We were not threatening a civil lawsuit. We were promising a felony indictment. Marcus drafted the notice within the hour. He dispatched a specialized legal courier to deliver the document directly to Caroline's hands. I authorized him to send a digital copy to her personal email, her wedding planner's email, and my father's corporate email address. I wanted the entire network to see the electrified fence I had just erected around my life. I sat in the quiet cabin of my truck, envisioning the moment the digital files landed in their inboxes. Caroline would read the cold, clinical recitation of her own criminal acts. She would see the potential prison sentences listed in bold black ink. The illusion of her untouchable status would evaporate. she would realize that the sister she had bullied for nearly 3 decades was holding the power to destroy her curated life with a single signature. The boundary was no longer just a wooden porch or a locked door. It was a reinforced steel barricade lined with high-voltage wire. I had trapped them in their own desperate mechanics. They had no venue. They had no vendors. They had no leverage. They were entirely isolated in a prison constructed from their own entitlement. I put my truck into gear and drove back up toward the stone chapel. David and his parents were inside restoring the beauty of the historic estate, unaware of the ugly desperation unfolding in the valley below. I felt a deep, unwavering resolve. I had neutralized the threat, but I knew the ecosystem of my biological family too well. When a predator realizes it cannot break through a fence with sheer force, it attempts to slide under it using a softer approach. The threats had failed. The social isolation had failed. The sabotage had resulted in a criminal warning. They had exhausted their arsenal of hostility. There was only one tactic remaining in their playbook. I knew with absolute certainty that the tears were coming next. I prepared myself for the arrival of the counterfeit apology. 2 weeks remained until October 14th. The crisp Appalachian mountain air carried the scent of curing sealant and dried autumn leaves. I spent the morning applying a final coat of matte varnish to the restored heart pine floorboards inside the stone chapel. The rhythmic motion of the applicator brushed away the lingering echoes of the recent legal battles. My business was thriving in the quiet. The holding company accounts reflected solid growth fueled by lucrative commercial contracts. One such agreement involved an online channel named Linda Vengeance, a digital broadcasting network that had secured the estate for a sprawling creative summit. That single client injected robust capital into my operating budget. I did not need my parents' wealth. I did not require their conditional approval. I possessed a tangible, profitable fortress built from my own resilience and metric-driven planning. The physical environment around me was pristine. My chosen family had helped me secure the final architectural fixtures, transforming the abandoned ruin into a premier commercial asset. The criminal notice sent by my attorney to Caroline had achieved its intended effect. The fraudulent phone calls to my vendors ceased instantly. A heavy tension settled over the valley, resembling the kind of stillness that precedes a sudden shift in barometric pressure. I knew the silence was unnatural. My biological relatives were running out of time. They had exhausted intimidation, societal isolation, and illegal sabotage. Only one strategy remained in the narcissist playbook when all forceful methods fail. They rely on the performance of contrition. The crunch of tires on gravel interrupted the quiet hum of the chapel ventilation system. I lowered my tools and walked toward the heavy mahogany entry doors. A sleek white luxury sedan idled in the circular driveway. My mother emerged from the driver's seat. Vivian did not wear her usual tailored country club attire. She wore a soft, beige cashmere cardigan and flat walking shoes, a wardrobe carefully selected to project humility and vulnerability. She carried a pristine white linen tissue clutched in her right hand. The visual messaging was unambiguous. She was arriving as a supplicant, waving a flag of surrender. I stood on the stone threshold, wiping dust from my hands, and watched her approach. Vivian stopped at the base of the chapel steps. She looked up at the towering stone facade, her eyes shining with manufactured moisture. She pressed the linen tissue to the corner of her eye, capturing a single, perfectly timed tear. "Penelope," she said, her voice trembling with practiced fragility, "this dispute has gone too far. This entire situation is tearing our family apart, and I cannot bear to watch my daughters fight like this anymore." She climbed the first stone step, shortening the physical distance between us. She spoke about the approaching wedding date. She stated Caroline was in a dark place, struggling to find any suitable location on such short notice. Preston's affluent Geneva investors were demanding details for their travel arrangements. Richard was pacing the hardwood floors at night, burdened by the stress of an impending social humiliation. Vivian framed the circumstances as a collective tragedy, ignoring the simple fact that they authored every single page of the crisis. Then she presented her solution. She clasped her hands together, holding the tissue like a fragile dove. She suggested we bridge the divide. She proposed a compromise that would heal the fractured family dynamic and salvage the October 14th date for everyone. A double wedding. Vivian painted a vivid cinematic picture of the event. She described the two sisters standing side by side at the altar, sharing the spotlight in a beautiful display of unity. She mentioned the local high society magazines would eagerly feature the story, praising our familial bond. The narrative would erase the ugly country club rumors she had initiated just days prior. It would be a triumph of forgiveness. She begged me to be the bigger person, to rise above the petty squabbles and open the doors of my venue to my desperate sister. I listened to her plea without altering my expression. My architectural training dictates how I view the physical world. When examining a historic building, you must look past the fresh coat of paint and assess the load-bearing columns. You tap the timber to check for internal decay. I applied the same diagnostic criteria to my mother's apology. I stripped away the soft cashmere cardigan and the trembling vocal delivery. I examined the core structure of her proposal. The apology was structurally unsound. It was built on a foundation of rot. The concept of a double wedding was merely a Trojan horse. It was a deceptive vehicle designed to bypass my fortified boundaries. If I agreed to her terms, Caroline would invade the venue without paying a single dollar. She would commandeer the aisle, monopolize the photographer, and dictate the timeline to suit her own opulent tastes. I would be relegated to the role of a supporting character at my own celebration, footing the entire bill for her extravagant catering demands, while she absorbed the adulation of Preston's wealthy guests. The tearful plea for forgiveness was nothing but cheap sentiment painted over a desperate parasitic extraction. I did not invite her inside. I stood firm on the threshold, blocking the entrance to my sanctuary. I looked at the linen tissue resting in her hand. "You are not apologizing for stealing my date," I said, keeping my voice low and measured. "You are apologizing because you ran out of options. You tried to bully me on my porch. You tried to ruin my reputation among the extended family. Caroline tried to commit wire fraud by impersonating me to my vendors. Now that you face the consequences of your own actions, you want me to subsidize a rescue mission." Vivian opened her mouth to protest, raising the tissue toward her eyes once more. I cut her off before she could form the words. "There will be no double wedding, Mother. Caroline is not stepping foot on this property. You are not bringing Preston's investors to my estate. The negotiation is over. The door is closed, it is locked, and the deadbolt is thrown." The transformation was instantaneous. The manufactured tears vanished, evaporating into the crisp mountain air. Vivian lowered the linen tissue. Her posture straightened, the fragile vulnerability instantly replaced by rigid, venomous hostility. Her eyes narrowed into sharp, cold slits. The mother, pleading for family unity, disappeared, revealing the calculating socialite who despised losing control. "You selfish, ungrateful child," Vivian hissed. Her voice dropped its trembling cadence, echoing with bitter resentment. "You would rather watch your sister suffer a public humiliation than share a building you keep hidden in the woods. You are going to regret this stubborn arrogance, Penelope. We will find a way to celebrate Caroline, and you will not be a part of it." I watched her turn around and march back toward the white sedan. Her flat shoes hit the gravel with sharp, forceful strikes. She jerked the car door open and slid into the driver's seat and sped away down the winding road, leaving a cloud of gray dust hovering in her wake. The brief confrontation confirmed everything I knew to be true. Her sorrow was counterfeit, but her rage was authentic. I returned to the sanctuary and picked up my tools, my resolve harder than the native riverstone surrounding me. The counterfeit apology was the final attempt to breach my walls using direct engagement. My refusal sealed the perimeter, but I knew the elite circles of North Carolina high society operated on a complex network of public perception. If Vivian and Richard could not force me to host the wedding, they would orchestrate a scenario designed to force my compliance through sheer public pressure. 3 days later, a thick envelope bearing the return address of the local country club arrived in my mailbox. The contents indicated they had secured a backup location for an alternative event, and they were setting a trap on their home turf. The thick envelope arrived in my mailbox on a Thursday afternoon, smelling faintly of the expensive lavender perfume my mother favored. It was constructed from premium heavyweight cardstock, the kind reserved for elite social correspondents. I carried the pristine white square into my kitchen and sliced the sealed flap open with a stainless steel utility knife. I pulled out a formal invitation featuring embossed gold lettering. The ink near the bottom edge was slightly smeared, a subtle structural flaw that revealed the rushed nature of the printing process. The text announced an engagement celebration and alternative wedding announcement for Caroline and Preston, hosted by Richard and Vivian Hayes at the prestigious Asheville Country Club. The event was scheduled for Saturday evening, just 2 days away. The desperate reality of their situation was printed in plain ink. My mother and sister had failed to secure a replacement venue. Peak autumn season in the Blue Ridge Mountains is an unyielding metric offering zero vacancy for sudden demands. Unable to host the Grand Society wedding they promised Preston's affluent Geneva investors, my parents engineered a hasty pivot. They rented a ballroom at their country club to host a glorified cocktail party, attempting to reframe their logistical failure as an exclusive, intimate gathering. I read the final line of the invitation. My own name was listed as an honored guest. The invitation was not a peace offering. It was a calculated trap. In North Carolina high society, optics govern every interaction. Vivian and Richard had spent the past week saturating their social circles with the toxic narrative that I was suffering a jealous mental breakdown. By inviting me to this high-profile gathering, they were orchestrating a public theater. They intended to parade Caroline and Preston in front of the local elite, forcing me to stand in the corner as the unstable, bitter sister. They assumed the rigid rules of Southern politeness would bind my hands, expecting me to swallow my pride and endure the humiliation in silence. David stood in the doorway of the kitchen, watching me trace the embossed gold foil with my index finger. He walked over, picked up the cardstock, and read the text. He set it down on the granite counter and placed a warm, steady hand on my shoulder. "You do not have to go," David said. His tone was gentle, devoid of any pressure. "We can stay here tonight. We can ignore them and let them play their games in a vacuum. You do not owe them your presence at an ambush." I leaned into his touch, drawing strength from his quiet solidarity. I looked out the kitchen window, analyzing the rolling ridges of the mountain range. In architectural restoration, you learn a hard truth about decaying structures. If you ignore a critical fracture in the foundation, the damage does not halt. It spreads upward, compromising the load-bearing beams until the entire building collapses on top of you. You cannot walk away from a compromised structure. You have to face the rot, expose the damaged beams, and surgically demolish the unstable elements to protect the surrounding framework. "I am going," I told David. My voice was calm, anchored by an unyielding resolve. "I have ignored the fractures for 28 years, hoping the foundation would hold. I am tired of bracing their walls. It is time to close the account." I did not dress for the event intending to blend into the background. I refused to play the role of the diminished, struggling blue-collar worker they had described to their friends. I intended to walk into that country club projecting the reality of who I was, an independent, highly successful corporate executive. I bypassed the subdued pastel dresses in my closet. I selected a structured emerald silk gown that fell past my knees, tailored with sharp, precise geometric lines. The deep green fabric mirrored the resilient, enduring nature of the native pine trees surrounding my estate. I pulled my hair back into a sleek, severe style, eliminating any soft, vulnerable edges. I stepped into a pair of black heels that struck the hardwood floor with the rhythmic, definitive sound of a metronome. I walked into my home office and opened the fireproof safe. I retrieved the thick manila folder containing the entire documented history of my family's extraction attempts. It held the screenshots of my mother's demands, the signed vendor release forms, the verified property deed, the extortionate cease and desist letter, and the formal legal notice of criminal intent regarding Caroline's wire fraud. I placed the dense stack of papers inside a sleek black leather portfolio. The portfolio was heavy, carrying the undeniable weight of empirical truth. I drove alone to the Asheville Country Club, arriving just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, sharp shadows across the manicured golf course. The building was a sprawling colonial estate, featuring towering white columns and expansive verandas designed to project generational wealth. The valets hurried to open the doors for arriving guests, driving a parade of luxury sedans away into the dark. I handed my keys to a young attendant, gripping the leather portfolio in my right hand. I climbed the wide marble steps and approached the heavy mahogany double doors leading into the grand ballroom. I paused on the threshold, taking a slow, measured breath. The air inside smelled of expensive gin-roasted pecans and heavy floral arrangements attempting to mask the scent of desperation. I stepped into the room. The ballroom contained roughly 150 people. The crowd was a dense mixture of local real estate brokers, charity board directors, and the affluent overseas investors connected to Preston's logistics empire. The ambient noise was a steady hum of polite laughter and clinking crystal glasses. Then someone near the entrance noticed me. The shift in the atmospheric pressure was instantaneous. A sudden, sharp hush radiated outward from the doorway, rippling across the crowded floor like a cold draft moving through an unsealed corridor. The polite laughter faltered. The rhythmic clink of ice cubes against crystal went entirely still. 150 faces turned toward the entrance, their eyes locking onto my emerald dress. I felt the dense, oppressive weight of the false narrative pressing against me. I saw my Aunt Margaret whispering behind a cocktail napkin to a woman wearing a heavy pearl necklace. I saw my cousins avert their gazes, pretending to examine the elaborate ice sculpture near the bar. The local guests viewed me through a lens of manufactured pity and morbid curiosity, expecting to see the unstable, jealous sibling Vivian had described. Preston's international guests looked confused by the sudden drop in volume, sensing a shift in the social current they did not fully understand. I did not shrink. I did not lower my eyes to the polished hardwood floor. I maintained a straight, unyielding posture, my heels clicking with precise cadence as I walked directly into the center of the hostile room. My parents were holding court near the front of the ballroom, standing beside a raised wooden podium flanked by towering white floral displays. Caroline stood beside them, clinging to Preston's arm. She wore a white silk cocktail dress, attempting to project the radiant energy of a bride, though the rigid tension in her jaw betrayed her panic. Vivian and Richard saw me approaching. They did not look alarmed by my presence. They looked triumphant. A slow, predatory smile spread across my father's face. He leaned down and whispered something into my mother's ear. Vivian nodded, her eyes flashing with cruel satisfaction. They believed their trap had worked flawlessly. They assumed I had arrived to grovel, forced into compliance by the sheer crushing weight of their social influence. They thought they had successfully cornered me in a venue governed by the strict, unspoken rules of Southern etiquette, a space where raising your voice was considered an unforgivable offense. They expected me to stand quietly near the back wall, absorbing their passive-aggressive insults while they claimed victory over my life. They were preparing to execute a public humiliation, confident that I lacked the ammunition to return fire. I stopped 10 feet away from the podium, holding my leather portfolio against my side. I met my father's gaze with an expression of cold, clinical detachment. I was not bound by the rules of their social club. I did not care about the opinions of the people whispering behind their cocktail napkins. A sharp, high-pitched whine echoed through the ballroom as the audio technician tested the microphone on the wooden podium. The scattered whispers faded into silence. The guests turned their attention toward the front of the room, sensing the scheduled program was about to begin. Richard adjusted his tailored suit jacket and stepped up to the microphone. He tapped a silver spoon against his crystal glass, a crisp, commanding sound designed to focus the room entirely on his voice. The stage was set for their grand performance. The audience was captive. The illusion was secure. I stood in the center of the silent ballroom, my hand resting on the smooth leather of my portfolio, and waited for my father to hand me the hammer. Richard stood behind the wooden podium located at the front of the grand ballroom. He adjusted his tailored suit lapels, projecting the polished image of a benevolent patriarch. The crystal chandeliers overhead cast a warm golden hue across his silver hair. He tapped the microphone with his index finger. The high-frequency audio feedback settled into a dull hum. 150 influential guests paused their conversations and focused their attention on the stage. This was his preferred environment. He was a broker closing the most critical transaction of his fiscal year, and the audience was captive. He began his speech with a sweeping tribute to his eldest daughter. He praised Caroline's elegance, her radiant spirit, and her flawless taste. He welcomed Preston into the fold, gesturing toward the young heir with a raised champagne flute. He spoke eloquently about the merging of two proud lineages, blending Southern heritage with international industry. His delivery was smooth, practiced, and highly persuasive. Then the narrative shifted. The cadence of his voice slowed, adopting a tone of rehearsed paternal sorrow. He introduced the concept of hardship into his toast. He addressed the sudden change in their wedding plans, dismissing the loss of the original venue as a minor logistical hurdle that only served to strengthen their familial bond. He wove a fiction of resilience, portraying his household as an unbreakable fortress of unity. And then came the calculated strike. Layer 7 of the conflict was deployed under the guise of an evening toast. Richard gripped the edges of the wooden podium. He leaned closer to the microphone. He spoke about the heavy burden of expectation. He stated that not everyone possesses the structural integrity to handle the rigorous pressures of high society. Sometimes, he intoned, those closest to us stumble. Sometimes the physical toll of manual labor and the bitterness of unfulfilled ambition cloud a person's judgment. He spoke about the necessity of forgiving those who lose their way. He emphasized the virtue of family sacrifice, claiming that true grace requires absorbing the erratic behavior of a troubled relative. He turned his head and locked his gaze directly on me. The entire ballroom followed his line of sight. 150 pairs of eyes pivoted toward the emerald silk dress standing in the center of the floor. The silence was dense and suffocating. The guests waited for the predictable reaction. They expected the fragile, struggling sister to crumble under the intense spotlight. They anticipated tears, a rushed exit, a shameful retreat into the night. They were waiting for me to validate the narrative my parents had spent a week constructing in the country club lounges. I did not lower my chin. I did not blink. I analyzed the mechanics of his speech. It was a load-bearing test designed to measure the breaking point of my composure. He was applying maximum psychological pressure, assuming my foundation was built on the same hollow insecurities that governed his own life. He miscalculated the tensile strength of his target. I took a slow breath. The oxygen filled my lungs, cold and steady. I lifted my right foot and stepped forward. My heel struck the polished hardwood floor. The sharp, rhythmic sound echoed through the quiet space. I took another step, then another. I did not rush. I walked with the deliberate, measured pace of an architect inspecting a condemned property. The crowd parted instinctively, stepping back to clear a direct path to the front of the room. Richard watched me approach. His manufactured smile faltered for a fraction of a second. A brief flicker of uncertainty crossed his eyes. He had scripted my flight, not my advance. He maintained his grip on the podium, white-knuckled, trying to project immovable authority. Vivian sat at the head table, her posture rigid, the color draining from her cheeks. Caroline clutched Preston's arm, her knuckles pale, sensing a disruption in the choreography she could not control. I bypassed the podium entirely. I did not need a microphone to command the acoustics of the room. I stopped in front of the primary VIP table situated just below the stage. This table was occupied by Preston's parents, Winston and Sylvia. They represented generations of quiet, disciplined wealth from Geneva. They were individuals who abhorred public scandal, conducting their corporate and personal affairs behind closed doors with ironclad discretion. They wore understated, bespoke clothing. They watched my approach with guarded, analytical curiosity, their expressions unreadable. I stood before them. I turned slightly, ensuring my profile was visible to my father at the podium, but my attention remained focused on the international investors. "Thank you, Father," I said. My voice was clear-pitched, at a volume that carried effortlessly to the back walls of the ballroom. The tone was surgical, stripped of any anger or sorrow. It was the voice of a professional delivering a structural audit. "Thank you for that profound lesson in family sacrifice." A collective intake of breath rippled through the surrounding tables. I unclasped the sleek black leather portfolio resting under my arm. I opened the cover. Inside sat the thick manila folder, heavy with the documented reality of the past few weeks. I extracted the folder and held it in both hands. "Sacrifice in this family is a very specific metric." I continued, my gaze fixed on Winston. "It is not an abstract concept. It is an administrative mandate. It requires surrendering your assets to sustain an illusion. But illusions are expensive to maintain, and eventually the creditors come to collect." Richard cleared his throat loudly into the microphone, attempting to interrupt the broadcast. "Penelope," he warned, his voice tight and breathless, "this is not the time or the place. Do not humiliate yourself further." I ignored the static. I looked down at the pristine white linen tablecloth covering Winston and Sylvia's table. I placed the manila folder directly in front of Winston's crystal water goblet. The rough paper provided a stark contrast to the refined fabric beneath it. I did not open the folder. I did not read the contents aloud. I did not need to perform a theatrical reading for the crowd. The intended audience was sitting right in front of me. Inside that file, I said, maintaining direct eye contact with the patriarch of the logistics empire, you will find the recorded deed to the commercial estate my sister attempted to claim. You will find a formal cease and desist order drafted by my father's law firm attempting to extort that property from me to cover his own leveraging deficits. And you will find a legal notice of criminal intent documenting the wire fraud my sister committed when she impersonated me to steal funds from my commercial vendors. Sylvia's hand paused inches from her wine glass. Winston looked down at the plain, unmarked folder resting on his table. The air in the ballroom went entirely still. The ambient hum of the ventilation system became the loudest sound in the space. I took half a step back, separating myself from their table. I delivered the final, calculated blow. "Before you marry into this family," I said, my voice ringing with cold, final authority, "you should review their ledgers." The words landed with the devastating impact of a controlled demolition. The silence that followed was not merely the absence of noise, it was a physical entity heavy and suffocating. It was the sound of a carefully constructed social facade disintegrating into dust. I looked at Richard. The microphone hung uselessly near his mouth. The confident color had vanished from his face, leaving him looking hollow and aged. He was paralyzed, trapped in a public execution of his own design. He could not deny the existence of the documents sitting in plain view. He could not spin a narrative to counter the physical evidence resting under the hands of his crucial investors. I looked at Vivian. She was staring at the manila folder with wide, terrified eyes, realizing that every lie she had planted in the country club over the past week had just been uprooted and exposed to the precise people she needed to impress. Caroline was trembling, shrinking behind Preston. The radiant bride was reduced to a frightened thief caught in the unforgiving glare of the spotlight. I did not wait for a rebuttal. I did not linger to watch the structural collapse. I had delivered the audit. My work was finished. I turned my back on the podium. I walked down the center aisle of the ballroom, my heels striking the floor with the same precise, unhurried rhythm. The crowd parted before me, their faces reflecting a mixture of shock, awe, and raw horror. The whisper campaign was dead. The financial extortion was neutralized. The criminal sabotage was exposed for the world to see. I pushed open the heavy mahogany double doors and stepped out onto the expansive veranda. The cool night air washed over me, smelling of pine needles and distant rain. I walked toward the valet stand, leaving the suffocating theater of their high society ruin behind me. The heavy, invisible debt I had carried for 28 years was officially canceled, paid in full with a single stack of paper. I stood on the expansive stone veranda, the cool Appalachian night air pulling the heat from my skin. I did not rush to the valet stand. I turned around and looked back through the floor-to-ceiling glass panes flanking the mahogany doors. I was an architect observing the final stages of a controlled demolition. The acoustics of the ballroom were muted through the thick glass, transforming the scene into a silent film of social ruin. Winston did not ignore the manila folder. Men who run international logistics empires do not accumulate generational wealth by ignoring audits. He reached across the white linen tablecloth. He opened the cover. Sylvia leaned inward, her posture rigid, her eyes tracking the documents. I watched Winston's eyes scan the notarized property deed. He turned the page. He read the extortionate demand drafted by my father's corporate firm. He turned the page again. He processed the statutory penal codes detailing Caroline's wire fraud. The entire evaluation required less than 90 seconds. Winston closed the folder. He placed his hand flat on top of the cardboard, sealing the verdict. Winston stood up from his chair. Sylvia rose in tandem, picking up her evening clutch. They did not shout. They did not cause a theatrical scene. High society executions are performed in sterile, quiet environments. Winston looked at his son. He offered a single, definitive tilt of his head toward the exit. Preston understood the directive. He was a hollow man, and hollow men lack the structural integrity to withstand a financial quarantine. He faced a choice between a bride with a fraudulent pedigree and a trust fund tied to a global empire. He chose his inheritance. Preston peeled Caroline's fingers off his tuxedo jacket. He turned his back on the radiant bride and followed his parents toward the side exit, leaving Caroline standing alone in the center of the ballroom in her white silk dress. The Geneva investors were terminating the merger. Caroline registered the movement. The ticking clock she had feared for a week finally struck zero. The curated pastel-filtered persona she maintained for her digital followers fractured, shattering into jagged splinters. The golden child cracked in front of 150 elite witnesses. Through the glass I could not hear her voice, but I read the frantic, sharp angles of her body language. She lunged forward, screaming toward the retreating backs of Preston's family. When they did not stop, the rejection broke her remaining restraints. Caroline stomped her heel against the hardwood floor. She picked up a crystal champagne flute from a nearby table and hurled it toward the wooden podium. The glass shattered against the polished wood, sparkling fragments raining down around my father's polished leather shoes. The remaining guests recoiled. The polite, hushed whispers morphed into audible, unvarnished shock. My Aunt Margaret, the woman who had sent me the passive-aggressive email about my mental health, stood with her hand clamped over her mouth. The town elite were witnessing the raw, unhinged reality of the Hayes household. The influencer brand was liquidated in front of the exact demographic they needed to impress. The whisper campaign Vivian had engineered reversed its current instantly. The guests were no longer looking at the doors with pity for the unstable sister. They were staring at the stage with profound, icy revulsion. I shifted my gaze to my parents. They were paralyzed. Richard stood frozen behind the microphone. His hands gripped the edges of the podium, his knuckles stark white, but he issued no commands. The broker who negotiated million-dollar land deals had zero counteroffers for this deficit. He watched his reputation, his social leverage, and his financial lifeline evaporate. He knew the rumors spreading through the country club tomorrow would center entirely on his fraudulent attempt to steal his own daughter's estate. Vivian sat at the head table, her face buried in her hands. The architect of the societal warfare was trapped in the rubble of her own design. She could not charm her way out of documented felony fraud. The social capital she valued above all else was bankrupt. I turned away from the glass. The theater held no further lessons for me. I walked down the marble steps toward the illuminated valet stand. A familiar vehicle was idling near the curb. It was not a luxury SUV. It was an 8-year-old blue sedan. David stood near the driver's side door, leaning against the frame. I had told him he did not need to attend the ambush, but he knew exactly when the extraction would be necessary. He had waited outside, a steady, reliable anchor in the autumn dark. I walked toward him. With every step across the paved driveway, a distinct physical sensation washed over my body. The invisible crushing weight I had carried since childhood began to dissolve. The obligation to absorb their toxic behavior, the requirement to shrink my own achievements to protect their fragile egos, the relentless demand to serve as the structural support for their hollow facade. It all slipped off my shoulders and vanished into the mountain wind. I felt light. I felt an unprecedented, soaring clarity. David opened the passenger door for me. He did not ask for a detailed summary of the ballroom carnage. He looked at my calm expression and understood the account was closed. I slid into the comfortable fabric seat. I placed the empty leather portfolio on the floorboard. It had served its purpose. I looked back at the sprawling colonial clubhouse one last time as David shifted the car into gear. My biological parents were inside, trapped in a prison constructed entirely from their own entitlement and deceit. We drove away, leaving the manicured golf course behind, heading toward the quiet sanctuary of the mountains. For 28 years, I believed blood dictated duty. Society conditions us to accept intolerable cruelty from the people who share our genetic code. We are taught that family is a permanent, binding contract, and walking away constitutes a moral failure. We are instructed to forgive endless transgressions simply because we share a surname. But examining the wreckage I left behind, I rewrote the formula. In architectural restoration, you learn a fundamental truth about decaying properties. You cannot save a structure if the foundation is compromised by persistent rot. You cannot patch a load-bearing column that is designed to fail. Blood only determines your geographical starting point. It provides the initial coordinates of your existence. It does not mandate a lifelong sentence. Sharing DNA does not obligate you to remain inside a burning building while the occupants pour gasoline on the floorboards. Loyalty is an earned metric, verified through mutual respect, consistent shelter, and the willingness to stand beside someone when the fire starts. I had spent my life setting myself on fire to keep my parents warm, and they had only complained about the smoke. The flames were no longer my problem. I rolled down the passenger window, letting the crisp night air fill the cabin of the sedan. The heavy burden of the past was gone, clearing the site for new construction. I reached across the center console and took David's hand. We had exactly 14 days left until October 14th, and we had a restored stone chapel waiting to be filled with the people who actually belonged there. October 14th dawned clear and crisp over the Blue Ridge Mountains. Frost clung to the jagged edges of the blackberry bushes lining the gravel driveway, reflecting the pale silver light of the early morning. I arrived at the stone chapel hours before the scheduled ceremony. I did not bring an entourage of frantic bridesmaids or a stressed event coordinator carrying a clipboard. I walked into the sanctuary alone to experience the silence. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut behind me, sealing out the sharp autumn wind. The interior air smelled of cured linseed oil, aged heart pine, and the faint sweet aroma of native ghost orchids. I stood in the center of the nave and watched the rising sun ignite the restored stained glass windows. Beams of ruby amber and cobalt fractured across the polished floorboards. I had spent countless hours suspended on steel scaffolding, carefully replacing the lead camming around those delicate glass panels. Now the vibrant colors washed over my shoulders, wrapping me in a warmth I had engineered with my own calloused hands. The guest list for our celebration contained exactly 42 names. We did not invite distant relatives out of obligation. We did not host local business associates to leverage future corporate alliances. Every single chair was filled by a person who had proven their loyalty when the structural load became heavy. Thomas and Martha arrived early, carrying wooden boxes of hand-stitched linen napkins. They greeted our friends at the entrance with genuine smiles, lacking any curated pretense. Elias, the caterer, operated the commercial kitchen with quiet efficiency. The estate soon filled with the rich scent of roasted local quail, cast-iron seared root vegetables, and wild mountain honey. Clara arrived with galvanized buckets of fresh flora, arranging the blooms naturally along the stone altar, without forcing them into rigid, unnatural shapes. The atmosphere lacked the suffocating tension that defined my parents' formal gatherings. There were no photographers staging performative portraits. There were no passive toasts masking deep generational resentments. We created a space governed by authentic, earned peace. When the time arrived to begin the ceremony, I did not wait in the vestibule for my father to escort me. The tradition of a man handing a woman over to another man felt entirely obsolete. I did not require a chaperone to cross a threshold I owned. I wore a simple, tailored ivory gown crafted from raw silk, free of heavy embellishments or restrictive corsetry. I pushed open the mahogany doors and walked down the center aisle alone. The soles of my shoes stepped softly over the secure level floorboards. I looked toward the altar. David stood waiting in a dark charcoal suit. His expression held no panic, no hollow posturing. He projected steady, unwavering security. When I reached the front of the room, he extended his hand. I placed my fingers in his palm, feeling the rough, honest texture of his skin. The sensation grounded me. His grip was a quiet promise of endurance. We exchanged vows we wrote ourselves, speaking in low tones meant only for our ears. We did not perform for an audience. We simply forged a permanent alliance. We spent the afternoon eating at long wooden tables, listening to soft acoustic music, and watching the sun trace a slow golden arc over the Appalachian peaks. I watched David share a joke with his father. I watched Martha pour wine for my lead contractor. I looked around the room and realized I did not miss the people who were absent. The void they left behind was not an empty hole. It was cleared acreage primed for new growth. The toxic debris was hauled away, leaving pristine ground. I received fragments of news about my biological relatives in the months following that October afternoon. The updates arrived through distant vendors and brief encounters in the city. The information registered as clinical data rather than emotional blows. Caroline's engagement terminated less than 48 hours after the country club disaster. The Geneva investors withdrew their capital from the region, entirely canceling the lucrative corporate merger. Without that crucial financial infusion, Richard's real estate brokerage suffered a severe fiscal contraction. Public records indicated he lost key commercial contracts as the local elite distanced themselves from his documented extortion attempts. He eventually vacated his premium downtown office space, downsizing to a modest suburban strip mall. Vivian resigned from her prominent charity board seats, retreating into the quiet isolation of her sprawling, lonely house. They built their entire existence on the fragile perception of superior status. When the mirror shattered, they found themselves trapped in a room with no exits and no remaining currency. I rarely think of them now. I harbor no lingering vengeance or burning resentment. You do not mourn a termite infestation after you replace the damaged wood. You simply enjoy the stability of a strong floor. My life is filled with the tangible metrics of success. I expand my commercial portfolio, securing new historic properties across the state. I share quiet evenings with a man who values my resilience. I maintain a family defined by mutual respect. The heavy brass keys in my purse no longer represent a hidden secret. They represent the literal and metaphorical doors I opened for myself. I want to speak directly to the woman listening to this story right now. Perhaps you are sitting in your car before walking into a tense family gathering. Maybe you are staring at a ceiling in the dark, calculating how much more weight you can carry for people who never express gratitude. You have been conditioned to believe that your role is to serve as the supporting character in someone else's grand narrative. You have been taught that setting boundaries is an act of betrayal. You have spent your entire life setting yourself on fire to keep your relatives warm, and you are tired of sweeping up your own ashes. Hear me clearly. Sharing DNA does not obligate you to endure systemic cruelty. You do not need permission to build your own sanctuary. Stop bracing their fragile walls. Secure your own foundation, draft your own contracts, sign your own paperwork, and invest your energy into the people who show up to help you carry the lumber. Honor is not a performance orchestrated for a country club audience. Honor is the quiet dignity you maintain when you refuse to surrender your assets to a thief. You hold the pen. You own the deed to your own life. If you found strength in this blueprint, hit the like button and subscribe to Linda Vengeance. We are building a community of the quiet ones, the unseen workers who finally stopped keeping the peace and started keeping the receipts. Drop a comment below and tell me about the moment you stopped bracing a toxic structure and finally built your own door. I will see you in the next episode. The foundation of a home is entirely invisible once the structure is built. We admire the sweeping verandas, the intricate crown molding, and the imported slate roofs, rarely sparing a thought for the concrete footings buried deep in the dark, unforgiving earth. Yet when the torrential storms inevitably arrive, it is not the decorative trim that saves the house, it is the foundation. The narrative of Penelope Hayes is far more than a satisfying account of a stolen wedding venue or a clever commercial real estate triumph. It is a profound diagnostic audit of the modern American family, exposing the devastating consequences of prioritizing the polished facade over the structural integrity of the home. At its core, this story forces us to hold up a mirror and examine our most fundamental parenting values. Richard and Vivian Hayes represented a specific tragic mutation of the American dream. They confused prestige with character, and they mistook social status for genuine success. In traditional American culture, the family structure was originally designed to function as a crucible for resilience, honesty, and moral fortitude. Parents were tasked with raising citizens capable of enduring hardship, speaking the truth, and contributing tangible value to their communities. It was a culture built on the quiet dignity of hard work, fairness, and family responsibility. But somewhere along the line, for families like the Hayes, the sacred duty of parenting devolved into a ruthless public relations campaign. Children ceased to be individuals requiring patient, emotional guidance, and instead became mere assets on a social ledger. They were measured solely by their ability to elevate the family's brand in the eyes of their country club peers. The message this imparts to American parents is both urgent and unyielding. Emotional awareness and absolute fairness are not optional luxuries in raising children. They are the essential load-bearing columns of a healthy family. When parents operate through toxic favoritism, designating a golden child to be worshipped while extracting endless labor and sacrifice from the other, they do not just harm the neglected sibling. They spiritually and morally cripple the favored one. Caroline was handed every unearned advantage, shielded from consequence, and praised for an illusion. As a result, she developed the structural integrity of spun glass, shattering into pieces and resorting to criminal fraud the moment she encountered a boundary she could not manipulate. True traditional family education demands that we teach our children the heavy weight of accountability. It requires parents to possess the emotional intelligence to see their children for who they truly are, rather than punishing them for failing to mirror an impossible curated fantasy. For the young people navigating the quiet, agonizing margins of their own families, Penelope imparts a message of stoic, undeniable empowerment. Her life proves that you do not need to wait for the architects of your pain to suddenly grant you a seat at their table. You are permitted to walk out of their house and build your own. She teaches young adults that discipline, silence, and metric-driven execution are far more powerful weapons than theatrical arguments or tearful pleas. Do not serve as the structural support beam for someone else's dysfunction. Secure your own deed, sign your own paperwork, and understand deeply that your worth is not dictated by the people who refuse to see it. If we shift our perspective and observe this societal dynamic through the lens of a spiritual practitioner, the collapse of the Hayes family offers a masterclass in the absolute necessity of self-cultivation. Modern American society is currently plagued by a desperate, insatiable hunger for external validation. We are starving for the approval of crowds, country clubs, and digital followers, constantly outsourcing our inner peace to the unpredictable opinions of strangers. From a spiritual standpoint, Richard and Vivian were trapped in a severe state of egoic delusion. They possessed immense material wealth, but lived in utter spiritual poverty, terrified of losing a reputation that was entirely hollow to begin with. A spiritual practitioner looks at this narrative and sees the urgent need for a return to inward development, the deliberate cultivation of wisdom, morality, and resilience. True spiritual resilience is not the ability to aggressively dominate others or manipulate circumstances to your advantage. It is the capacity to remain immovable in your own truth, much like Penelope standing calmly on her wooden porch while her father threatened her livelihood. To achieve a better life, one must sand away the ego, just as Penelope sanded the century-old floorboards of the stone chapel, painstakingly stripping away the cheap performative paint to reveal the honest, resilient grain underneath. We must cultivate a moral compass that points true, even in the dark, recognizing that taking what does not belong to us, whether it is a wedding venue, a sum of money, or a sibling's peace of mind, inevitably incurs a spiritual debt that will inevitably come due. If this reflection resonates with the quiet, careful architecture of your own life, I invite you to subscribe and follow Linda Vengeance. We are building a dedicated community for those who appreciate the quiet power of undeniable truth, replacing chaotic emotional battles with airtight boundaries and unyielding self-respect. Drop a comment below and share your own experiences of fortifying your foundation against those who tried to tear it down. As we walk away from the wreckage of the country club ballroom, leaving the Hayes family to their ruined ledger, we are left to confront a deeply ingrained societal dogma. We are relentlessly taught that blood is the ultimate unbreakable contract. Conventional wisdom dictates that family must be preserved at all costs, that forgiveness requires constant proximity, and that walking away is a fundamental failure of love and moral duty. We are told to keep the peace, to absorb the blows, and to continuously repair the burning building while the arsonist remains safely inside, still holding the matches. But perhaps we have misunderstood the true nature of love and consequence entirely. Perhaps true spiritual discipline does not mean staying to absorb the abuse indefinitely. Sometimes the most profound, loving action you can take for a toxic family is to stop shielding them from the consequences of their own destructive actions. By walking away, you remove the very safety net that allows their dysfunction to thrive in the dark. Forgiveness is not synonymous with access. You can forgive the termite for its destructive nature, but you do not invite it back into the timber of your home. The ultimate loyalty is not to the blood flowing in your veins, but to the truth of your own soul. In the end, walking away is not a failure of love. It is the absolute realization that sometimes leaving the people you love in the ruins of their own making is the only way they will ever be forced to finally meet themselves.